allegiance of individuals. Okay, the allegiance and loyalty of individuals is limited to the extent that the state fulfills its part of contract. Okay, now this was the idea that was proposed by John Locke, and now as I told you, John Locke also had introduced the concept of consent. Okay, he also had introduced the concept of consent. Now this concept of consent in the hands of John Locke had received a further attention. Okay, and he elaborated this concept of consent a little more. Okay, now you know that in elections, a lot of people display a little indifference or apathy to the electoral process, the democratic process. A lot of people also carry a lot of disbelief about democracy and its claim that it's the government of the people, by the people, and for the people. Now, why this apathy? Is probably because of some problems in operationalizing democracy. This apathy might be because of some problems in the electoral process. This apathy might also be because of the evils of party system, which have sometimes adopted unscrupulous methods to appeal and to articulate. And that's the reason why a good number of people carry a lot of apathy towards democracy and the electoral process and so forth. And they don't care to go and vote in the elections. Can we really say that these people have rendered their support to the government? Okay? Or whether these people have given their consent to the government or not. It is here that John Locke had introduced a new concept. He introduces the concept of active and passive consent. Okay? He introduces the concept of active and passive consent. Now, in the course of social contract, some people might have actually given their consent actively by signing in the contract, by taking part in the entire process of the contract being brought into force. Okay, while there might be other people who have given their consent through silence. Okay, now this was called John Locke as passive consent. Today, you know that in an election, about 60% of people cast their vote, let's say. It means that the 40% of the people who have not exercised their vote had rendered their passive consent. Okay? And that is how we say that this is the government of the people. Right? Whether the people have exercised their right to vote or not, if they have remained neutral, if they have remained silent, if they remain inactive, it indicates that these people have given their passive consent. That had become the basis for liberal democracy today. Notwithstanding the fact that only a few people participate in elections and the voter turnout is hardly around 60 to 70%. Okay, it means that the entire people have given consent, the entire people have taken part in the process, and those people who have not voted in the election have rendered their passive consent. This was the concept of consent introduced by John Locke. Okay, and since then, this concept had become very important in operationalizing liberal democracy, the concept of active and passive consent. Okay, so slowly it was John Locke who for the first time insisted on a limited government, which today we understand as constitutional form of government. He also introduced the concept of active and passive consent, which has today become the basic idea behind what's called as liberal democracy. Okay, he also for the first time insisted on or emphasized on inalienable natural rights of individuals, rights which are granted by nature by virtue of a person being human. And this can be considered as a precursor to the modern idea of human rights. These were several telling contributions made by John Locke to the progress of political philosophy. Okay, so he believes now that the government had come into existence because of the people rendering their active and passive consent. So the government is an outcome of the people rendering their active and passive consent. Today, we have democratic governments. There are people who have actively consented, and there are people who have given their consent through their silence. Okay, so this concept of active and passive consent also is a contribution made by John Locke. Okay, now after having looked at the nature of contract, I told you that John Locke had deliberately designed the scheme of his contract so that his objectives are properly fulfilled. The objective of limiting the government. Okay, so from absolute state, we are slowly moving towards a constitutional government, a limited government. Okay, government which only performs limited functions and therefore only exercises limited powers. Okay, slowly the interests of bourgeois in imposing restraint on the exercise of power by the monarchy were being realized. That's the reason why John Locke is usually described as the intellectual godfather of the glorious revolution, which stripped the monarchy in England of its absolute powers and established a limited or a constitutional monarchy. Okay, the intellectual godfather of the glorious revolution was John Locke. Okay, now after having discussed the nature of contract, we'll proceed to try and understand the implications of his contract, which we have already discussed to some extent. By now, we'll try and understand the implications of the social contract proposed by John Locke. Implications of social contract. First, John Locke insists that both society as well as natural rights precedes the state. Society as well as natural rights precede the state. These have existed even before the state had come into existence. Okay, so social life was there even before political authority was established. Social relations and social interactions were there. Okay, even before the state had come into existence. There was something like a law of nature also that was present in establishing social relations in the state of nature. Okay, so society precedes the state. And as I told you, the implication is that the state therefore cannot superimpose itself on society. The state cannot therefore try to control and try to, regulate society. One. And secondly, even natural rights also precede the formation of state. It means individuals exercised these natural rights. Individuals possessed these natural rights even before the state had come into existence, even before the political authority was established at all. Individuals exercised these natural rights. Third, the government is based on active and passive consent. The government is based on active and passive consent. Okay, so the active and passive consent rendered by people led to the formation of government, led to the formation of state or political authority. Okay, that's the third implication. Fourth, state also is a party to the contract. State also is a party to the contract. If you remember, the second contract was entered into between the people and the state, and therefore state is a party to the contract. Okay, it means the state is subjected to the terms and conditions of the contract. The state cannot wield absolute or unlimited powers. The state is subjected to the terms and conditions of the contract. Okay, now that's the next aspect of Locke's writings. So state cannot just do whatever it wants to do. State cannot do as it wills. State is subjected to the terms and conditions of the contract. Okay. Next, fourth, the people do not surrender their natural rights. Okay, the people do not surrender their natural rights. So whatever the rights that people have surrendered are only rights related to determining the content of lawmaking, okay, or enforcement of these laws, implementation, and adjudication in case there is a dispute related to the interpretation of these laws. Only these three rights were surrendered by people. The rest of the rights are retained. So people retain their natural rights. And why did the state come into existence in the first place? What was the inconvenience in the state of nature which state requires to resolve? According to John Locke, the inconveniences in the state of nature is lack of formal law. Whatever the law that was there was only law of nature, which was just reason, which made people reasonable, ante. There was no formal law. This was the problem in the state of nature. Lack of formal law, lack of formal authority for enforcement of this law, okay, and lack of an impartial judge for adjudication in case of a dispute in interpretation of these laws. These were the only inconveniences in the state of nature which led to the possibility or potential of warfare in the state of nature. Okay, and therefore people have created the state. Therefore the state was formed for these reasons only, and only these rights are surrendered by people. Okay, state is therefore required to perform only these functions. The people have not surrendered their natural rights. Therefore the state is not absolute, and in case the state fails to perform these duties, individuals have a right to revolt against the state. Though John Locke considers a revolution as a destabilizing influence on society, okay, it had the potential of destabilizing influence. However, in case the state fails to protect these rights, these natural rights, the state has no right to continue. Individuals reserve their right to withdraw their consent. Okay, so John Locke therefore speaks about the right of people to revolt. Now please remember, according to John Locke, a revolution is primarily for effecting the change in the regime, one government being replaced by another government. Change in the regime. That is the limited meaning attributed to revolution by John Locke. Okay, John Locke proposes that the state should perform these limited functions, and in case state transgresses or the state expands its powers beyond these, or if state trespasses or violates rights of individuals, then individuals have rights to revolt. And revolution, according to John Locke, is only a change in the regime. One set of people being replaced by another set of people. Okay, that is his ideas about revolution. We'll discuss this a little more deeply because it was given in this year's civil service mains exam. Okay, Locke's ideas on revolution. Next, John Locke also here for the first time indicates that the functions of the state include lawmaking, execution, and adjudication. So he speaks about three different functions of the state. Now please remember that till this time there used to be monarch, and this monarch throughout the entire medieval period and even in the modern period initially also combined in himself the power to make laws, the power of administration or enforcement of these laws, as well as the power of adjudication. The king was the magistrate, the king was the administrator, the king also was the lawmaker. Okay, all the powers of the government were combined in one authority. It could be a monarch, or it could even be an aristocracy, a group of individuals. For the first time, John Locke was speaking about the separation of powers. So the earliest indication of the separation of powers can be seen in the writings of John Locke. Okay. So another implication of Locke's social contract is his ideas related to separation of powers. So he speaks about separation of powers between the various governmental organs. And since then, this concept had become very important in modern governance. The theory of separation of powers had become very important concept in modern governance. You know that the concept of the theory of separation of powers was more systematically enunciated or popularized by a modern French political scientist called Montesquieu. Please remember this name, Montesquieu, who wrote a book called The Spirit of Laws. Spirit of Laws. And in this book, Montesquieu for the first time proposed the theory of separation of powers. And he said that the powers of the government should be divided between various governmental organs in such a way that each organ acts as a check to balance the powers of other governmental organs so that individual liberty can be protected. So the primary objective of Montesquieu's theory of separation of powers is protection of individual liberty by ensuring that none of the governmental organs assumes dictatorial tendencies by concentrating all the power in itself. He believes that the power of the government should be divided between the various organs in such a way that each organ acts as a check over the others. And this was called the theory of separation of powers. And since then, it had become a very important theory. It had become a very important principle in the modern governance. Today also, we also, under the Indian Constitution, believe that the powers of the government should be divided, okay, between three organs. And there should not be any concentration of power. And please remember, Article 50 of the Indian Constitution, Article 50 of Part 4, that is Directive Principles of State Policy, implore that the state should take steps to separate judiciary from executive. This is what's called as separation of powers. And this executive should not be wielding judicial powers. Okay, there should be separation of judiciary from executive. One of the earliest exponents of this theory of separation of powers was John Locke. Okay, so another very important implication of John Locke's theory was separation of powers. Okay, so this is another very important aspect related to John Locke, right? Next, the fifth or the sixth implication of John Locke's social contract is his enunciation of what is called as political sovereignty. Political sovereignty. Now, if you remember, when we had discussed Thomas Hobbes, we discussed that Thomas Hobbes had given the concept of absolute sovereignty. Thomas Hobbes had given the concept of absolute sovereignty. He proposed a sovereign which was absolute, which wielded absolute powers. You know, law is the command of the sovereign. Individual's liberty is all that freedom permitted by sovereign through his silence. You know, Thomas Hobbes proposed unlimited loyalty of individuals to the state. Even if the ruler is bad, the individuals have got no right to revolt against the ruler unless the ruler himself violates individuals' right to life. Okay, so the ruler, till the time he is able to provide security to an individual's life, has complete right to complete obedience from his subjects. So Thomas Hobbes had created an absolute sovereign. Okay. Now John Locke, on the other hand, insisted that the power originally belongs to the people. And through their social contract, the people have only created deputies who will perform certain duties which actually belong to the people. You know. So the governmental functions actually belong to the people. The power of lawmaking, the power of enforcement, the power of adjudication. The problem in the state of nature was that every individual was the enforcer, every individual was a judge, and every individual was a lawmaker. Okay, that was the problem in the state of nature, which could have led to potential conflicts. And these powers, which originally belonged to the people, were now transferred to the government. Okay, so limited power only was given to the government. This idea that power, which originally belongs to the people, is to be exercised by a government on behalf of the people, gives rise to the idea of political sovereignty. Political sovereignty. Okay, as distinct from the idea of absolute sovereignty proposed by Thomas Hobbes. So the government, whatever the power it wields or whatever the power it exercises the power only on behalf of people. That power exercised by government belongs to the people. Okay, so that was the idea proposed by John Locke. Okay, and it is this idea of political sovereignty which had since become a very important element of the present governments as well. Okay, so these are the implications of the social contract proposed by John Locke. Please remember, the entire crux or the very essence of Locke's political philosophy can be discerned on the implications of the social contract. Today we speak about governments with limited powers. Today we speak about governments exercising power on behalf of people. Today we speak about the separation of powers. Today we speak about active and passive consent as the basis for liberal democracy. Now all these can be traced to the writings of John Locke. And this is where he occupies a very important place as far as the history of political thought is concerned. Okay. Next, very briefly, we'll try and discuss John Locke's ideas on what he calls as natural rights. What exactly does he mean by these natural rights? And what is he trying to tell us? Okay. And what is the implication of this theory of natural rights proposed by John Locke? John Locke's theory of natural rights. As we've been discussing all through, that John Locke had proposed his theory of natural rights. And this was in the context of the conditions during which he lived in England, which were relatively peaceful, stable, and people exercised a lot of freedom. And there was very active discussion or deliberation on what should be the extent of the government, how much of government. Okay, they were royalists and they were Puritans who had engaged in a lot of civil war previously, but things are now more or less settled in favor of the Puritans who had proposed that the government should be limited. Okay, and this was the time when the middle classes, the merchant classes, or the early capitalists were trying to very forcefully project the idea that they exercised rights. Okay, and these rights shall not be violable. These rights should be inviolable. And no matter what, these rights which belong to individuals are claims which cannot be overstepped or trespassed by the state. Okay, so this was the kind of atmosphere during which John Locke had proposed his theory of natural rights. Now, John Locke initially declares that the natural rights which individuals possess are rights which are granted by nature, and he also uses the expression God. Okay, rights granted by nature. And as I told you, he also uses the expression called God. Okay, so these are rights which are granted by nature. And why are these rights granted? These rights are granted to individuals so that they realize a good life. It's not enough if you are born, isn't it? We are born with a lot of capabilities. According to John Locke, individuals are born with capabilities which are unique to human beings. And we are born with these unique capabilities for a purpose, for a reason which is much beyond animal existence. You know, we are given the faculty of thinking, we are given the faculty of emotion, to feel love, to feel the urge to be loved, the urge for companionship, the urge to share and enter into social relations, the urge to satisfy and gratify our appetites, the faculty of thought and reason. We are given a lot of unique faculties by nature, and all these are given for a purpose, for a reason. And the reason, according to John Locke, is to realize a good life. And for us to realize a good life, we require certain conditions, which he calls as natural rights. So natural rights are conditions which are granted by nature or even God to help individuals realize a good life. That's the purpose for which we are granted these conditions. And without these, we cannot be said to be living a fulfilling life. Okay, so a life of fulfillment, according to John Locke, is not possible without these conditions. A life of fulfillment is not possible without these conditions, according to John Locke. So these conditions are required for individuals to lead a fulfilling life. Okay, now going ahead. So firstly, John Locke argues that individuals, or rather human beings, are granted some unique capabilities. Unlike other animals, you know, we are granted certain unique capabilities. Of course, you know that animals also have an instinct to associate themselves. You know, lions have their own pride. Okay, ants are organized into big colonies, kingdoms. You know, they're called sometimes as empires. Ants create their own empires. You know, so even animals also socialize. Even animals also establish their own social relationships. But the purposes for which human beings have formed into societies are much greater than the purposes for which these organisms, other organisms, have formed their societies and empires. Okay, for them probably it's just survival, but for us something else maybe. Okay, the purposes for which humans have organized into societies are far greater than those purposes for which other organisms have formed their societies. Okay, now John Locke proposes that, see, for realization of these higher purposes of social life, nature, which has granted us life, also had granted us certain rights. These rights are conditions which allow us to lead a good life or a fulfilling life. You know, so this is the first argument put forward by John Locke. And secondly, John Locke also argues that these rights cannot be surrendered. These rights are, individuals are born with these rights. They are natural. Today, you know that we understand rights as those which are offered by the Constitution as fundamental rights or other legal rights, you know. So we believe today that these rights are sourced by the Constitution or through laws made by legislatures. But you know, John Locke feels that there are certain rights with which we are born. These are natural rights. Okay, and these rights are essential conditions for individuals to realize a good life, and therefore they cannot be surrendered whatever the cost. These rights cannot be surrendered, because Without these rights or without these conditions, we cannot realize a good life. Therefore, these rights cannot be surrendered. Okay. And third, John Locke considers a right to property as a natural right. Okay. Whatever that individuals contain in themselves as their property is a natural right, cannot be surrendered. And John Locke includes three important elements of right to property: an individual's life, an individual's liberty, and an individual's possessions or estate as a part of his property. Okay, the life which is granted by nature, the liberty which individuals require to be their best selves, and the possessions or the estate or anything of value which is created by individual with the sweat of his hands and the toil of his brow. Okay, that is his property. It cannot be taken away from individuals. Now, these rights cannot be surrendered. Okay, he believes that these rights are required for individuals to realize their good life. And therefore, John Locke proposes utilitarian perspective of rights. Rights have a purpose, utility. Okay, the utility of these rights is to help individuals realize a good life. Utilitarian perspective of rights. Okay, right. So rights have a purpose, and rights are required by individuals for realizing a good life. Okay, and that's the purpose of rights. And therefore, he presents a utilitarian perspective of rights. Okay. Next, fourth, John Locke believes that every individual, even in the state of nature, is guided by the law of nature, which is reason, not to harm another in his life, liberty, or possessions. Therefore, individuals are born with a nature of reasonableness, not to harm another in his life, liberty, and possessions. So we all know that we have these natural rights. We are also guided by the law of nature, which is reason, to be reasonable in acknowledging and respecting other individuals' natural rights of life, liberty, and estate. Okay. 5. The problems in the state of nature arose primarily because of each individual himself assuming the responsibility of lawmaker, enforcer, as well as the adjudicator with respect to disputes related to natural rights. So therefore, the primary inconvenience in the state of nature was due to lack of adequate protection to natural rights. Okay, so individuals are guided by both reason as well as passion. We also are passionate. We are reasonable as well as we are passionate. We all have our reasons. We all have our passions. And sometimes, you know, we are more tempted by passions and we become unreasonable. You know, we are so much tempted by passion sometimes that we tend to cease to be reasonable. Okay, a person deeply immersed in love may not be able to think straight, isn't it? Okay, too much of obsession with a particular passion can make a man unreasonable. And every man, going to John Locke, is guided by both passion as well as reason. That makes individuals undependable. Okay, That leads to conflict, that leads to a state of war, and this was the inconvenience in the state of nature. Therefore, whatever are the inconveniences in the state of nature, they primarily arose because of lack of adequate protection to individuals' natural rights. Okay, that implored men to enter into a social contract. So the primary reason as to why individuals entered into a social contract is also for protection of natural rights. It is for, a strong protection of their natural rights that individuals have entered into a social contract, right? And this social contract in turn gives birth to state or political authority. Therefore, John Locke insists that the purpose for which the state is born, the purpose for which the state or political authority is born is for the purpose of protection of individuals' natural rights. The very purpose for which the state was born itself was for protection of natural rights of individuals. So it is for natural rights that we have the governments, the parliaments, the legal systems, the laws, everything is born for protection of individuals' natural rights. Okay? 7. John Locke, therefore, also insists that the primary duty of the state is to protect natural rights of individuals. That's the purpose for which the state itself is born. And in case the state fails to accord that protection to natural rights, then individuals reserve the right to revolt against the state. Right to revolt to individuals also emanates from John Locke's ideas or theory of natural rights. So please remember, the entire crux of Locke's theory is based on natural rights. The institutions have taken their birth for protection of natural rights. Individuals have rendered their consent for the formation of political authority for protection of their natural rights. Okay, so everything centers around the idea of natural rights. Why rights? Because these were required for the newly emerging capitalist classes as claims for their freedom, as claims for their need to have a limited government, for guarantee to their freedoms and liberty. Okay, so the concept of natural rights, therefore, was a very, very important contribution made by John Locke to the history of political thought. Okay, so this is his theory of natural rights. Okay, right, I hope the things are clear, right? Locke's views on human nature, how this human nature led to a state of nature, and what were the conditions in state of nature, and how these conditions in the state of nature implored men to enter into a social contract, and the purposes for which the social contract was entered into, the nature of social contract and the implications it carried. It creates a political sovereignty, it creates a limited government, it is primarily intended for better and more efficient protection of natural rights. Okay, and next, what are his ideas on natural rights? Okay, the theory of natural rights proposed by John Locke, right? The next aspect that we'll be discussing as far as John Locke is concerned is nature of the government or nature of state. What is the kind of state that John Locke proposes? By now, you must be having a clear idea of what John Locke is saying, right? Nature of state. So what is the kind of political authority or state that individuals have established following the social contract? Firstly, let's be very clear, okay? The sole purpose for which the state has come into existence is for protection of individuals' rights to property. The sole purpose. Just imagine that we had not seen such a big emphasis on right to property, even by Aristotle also. Aristotle had given one of the earliest justification of right to property, but such emphatic insistence on right to property also was not given by Aristotle. Okay. He says that the sole purpose for which individuals have entered into social contract and sole purpose for which the state itself had come into existence is for protection of right to property. State comes into existence for the protection of individuals' right to property, which includes his life, his liberty, as well as his possessions. The very purpose for which the state had come into existence is this. Okay, right. Secondly, John Locke also proposes a theory of separation of powers. Between legislature, executive, and judiciary, there should be separation of powers, right? He probably was the very first political thinker to identify that these three, lawmaking, law enforcement, and adjudication, are three distinct functions. Okay, so the state proposed by John Locke comprises of three distinct organs for three distinct purposes. This was the second idea proposed by John Locke. Third, the state is born out of the consent of individuals. And the nature of consent is both active as well as passive. The active and passive consent of individuals lead to the formation of state. Okay. Next, fourth, John Locke proposes a limited government wielding only limited powers. John Locke insists that because the functions of the state are limited, its powers also should be limited. Okay. Therefore, John Locke was probably the very first political thinker in the modern times who spoke about constitutional government or a limited government. Okay. So the limit of the state's power is to the extent of protection of natural rights. Till the time state is able to whatever are the functions which are required by the state to perform for protection of natural rights, its functions and its power should be limited to that extent. Okay, so he was the one who proposed a limited government. Next, John Locke was the very first political thinker who proposed the idea of political sovereignty. It means the state will exercise powers only on behalf of individuals. The powers belong to the individuals, and state only exercises those powers on behalf of individuals. This was another idea proposed by John Locke. Okay, right. And finally, one another aspect that we require to discuss as far as Locke's nature of state is, Locke proposes that the state should pursue the policy of religious toleration. Okay, and it should not try to impose itself on society, because society is born prior to the state. Okay, so state should follow the policy of religious toleration, allowing the society to have its own beliefs and faith and religious freedom. So this is the nature of state proposed by John Locke. So these are the points that you require to elaborate as far as Locke's theory of state is concerned. Okay, we'll stop here for today, right? Tomorrow we'll continue with John Locke and finish off with the rest of the ideas proposed by him. Okay, thank you so much.